Okay, so we're at 10:30, so we'll get started. Welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming into this second in a series of NSDF Environmental Assessment Follow-up Monitoring Program webinars. To start off, I would like to acknowledge the Algonquin Nation, whose traditional and unceded territory most of us are gathered upon today, and of course where the NSDF project is taking place. Today's topic for the follow-up monitoring program is the environmental monitoring program. So we're happy to have a few people on board with us here today to present on that. We will start, of course, with a little bit of an introduction to the presenters, and then we'll start with the presentation and follow that up with a Q&A session on the presentation. Then finally, we'll round things up with some closing remarks, and then close off and I'll give you the dates and times of the next monitoring program webinar. So first, some housekeeping. The format, this will be a presentation with a few pauses for questions. So throughout the presentation, we'll make sure we do pause and check in if there's any questions. But we will also have a formal question and answer period at the end of the presentation. We have two people with us today from the Environmental Monitoring Program, and I'll let them introduce themselves. But we have, I'll start with Carla.
Hi, I'm Carla. I'm section head of the monitoring programs at the Chalk River Labs. And I'll be presenting along with my coworker today.
Good morning.
And then we have, sorry, Annie, go ahead.
Thank you, Mitch. Good morning. I'm Annie Moray. I'm the section head of the Natural Resources branch with the Environmental Services, and I will be supporting Carla today.
Thank you very much, Annie. And I'm Mitch McKay. I'm the manager of stakeholder relations for the Environmental Remediation Management's team, and mainly working on the projects like NSDF and NPD and out at our Whiteshell site as well. And I will be facilitating the webinar today. We also have a few other people on the line today with us as well, just to help out with the Q&A section of the agenda. I'll ask if they're called upon to introduce themselves before they answer the question. Some etiquette for today. Everyone has the ability to come on camera and ask questions, but I do ask you to please keep yourself muted as we work through the presentation. If you do have a question, just raise your hand using the raise your hand function, which is at the bottom of the Zoom platform. You can see it there in the reactions button. There's a little raise hand icon in that. So if you could raise your hand, I'd be happy to call upon you to ask your question. As well, on the bottom, you'll see there's an interpretation button. This webinar is available in both official languages, both French and English, and you can access it by toggling through the globe icon on the bottom right of the Zoom bar there. You just select the language you would like to hear, and there is translation provided. And there is a slight lag in the translation, so please wait for the full translation to come through before speaking. And if you are asking your question in French, please speak clearly and slowly to help the translators out. So just a few clarifications. Today's topic is the environmental monitoring program, and that's kind of our focus today. So if you do have questions that sort of lie outside of today's webinar topics, please note those questions, and we'd be happy to follow up with you and answer that question. If we're able to answer the question on today's webinar, we do have a few people online that may be able to, but I would note that we are trying to focus just on the environmental monitoring program today. So please try to keep your questions focused on this EA FMP program and the environmental monitoring program. But like I said, if there is questions outside that scope, we would be happy to get back to you on those questions. And I would encourage you to ask your questions through the video chat function or the audio function. If it's absolutely necessary, please do type in your questions and I can ask them for, but I would like to encourage a little discussion. So please, if possible and you're comfortable, ask your question through audio or video. Okay, with that, I will hand it over to Carla.
Thanks, Mitch. So today's presentation is on the environmental monitoring program component of the NSDF Environmental Assessment Follow-up Monitoring Program. So I will use the acronym EAFMP perhaps throughout this presentation, just so you know this is what I mean by it, Environmental Assessment Follow-up Monitoring Program. Both my coworker Annie Morin, who introduced herself earlier, and I will be presenting today. There's a bit of a lag here. Just trying to move on to the next slide. Here we go. Here's a bit of an outline of our presentation. We will start by explaining what the NSDF EA follow-up monitoring program is as a whole. And next, we'll give an overview of the current site-wide monitoring program already in place, with specific emphasis on the environmental monitoring program component of it. So this covers contaminants pathways monitoring, as well as biodiversity monitoring. And finally, we'll get into the specifics of the NSDF specific EMP or NFDF specific environmental monitoring program, looking at the various locations that we'll be monitoring, the parameters, the frequency of the monitoring. We'll look at our tiered evaluation of results as a strategy, and the strategy of adaptive management and reporting. So what is the NSDF Environmental Assessment Follow-up Monitoring Program? What does it propose to do? The EAFMP is proposed to monitor those activities of the NSDF project and for various objectives. We would like it to verify the predictions of the environmental impact statement to confirm that there's no significant adverse effects occurring due to NSDF activities. We need it to ensure mitigation measures are performing as expected. We need the EAFMP to identify any unanticipated effects and to provide for the implementation of adaptive management to limit any unanticipated effects. The EAFMP is divided into 4 components: operational control monitoring, effluent verification monitoring, groundwater monitoring, and environmental monitoring, including biodiversity. And although there can be quite a bit of overlap between these different components, there are some distinguishing features. So an operational control monitoring program is meant to help ascertain the level of control or treatment of emissions. An example of operational control monitoring with respect to the NSDF would be visual inspections of dust, or confirmation that turtle fencing integrity is maintained. Effluent verification monitoring focuses on effluents. It focuses on analyzing what are the contaminants that are present in the releases that are released by the facility. Groundwater monitoring and environmental monitoring, in contrast, focus more on the receiving environment. What are the contaminants that are present in the receiving environment after releases have been released by the facility? Or in the case of biodiversity monitoring, focusing on the effects of physical disturbances in that receiving environment. So it's important to know, so today's presentation, just to be clear, will focus on the environmental monitoring portion of the EAFMP. It's important to note that the EAFMP is currently in draft, and we will be incorporating feedback from Indigenous communities and organizations, members of the public, and stakeholders. And the EAFMP will only be finalized after a decision by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. The EAFMP is designed to be compliant with the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission Regulatory Document 2.9.1 on environmental protection. It's designed to be compliant with CNL requirements for effluent, environmental, and groundwater monitoring. And it's also designed to be in line with Canadian Standards Association, CSA, and 288 series of standards. And finally, it's also designed to be compliant with the Species at Risk Act, Migratory Birds Convention Act. My apologies, the light is going off. And the Fisheries Act. Monitoring for NSDF will be similar to existing site-wide monitoring currently implemented at the Chalk River Laboratories. So before we focus on the NSDF specific environmental monitoring component, let's look at the current site-wide program already in place. The current site-wide program integrates effluent monitoring, environmental monitoring, and groundwater monitoring. This integration allows us to track the migration of contaminants throughout the various compartments of the environment, including the atmosphere, the biosphere, and the geosphere. For example, facility groundwater monitoring will inform us as to the types of monitoring that's required in the down gradient receiving water bodies. In the same way, liquid effluent monitoring from facilities will inform us again on what to monitor and how to monitor and where to monitor receiving surface water bodies. And air effluent monitoring from roof vents or stacks inform atmospheric deposition monitoring, ambient air monitoring, monitoring for soil and vegetation. It's important to note, and I'll note this now, that biodiversity monitoring is also a part of our integrated environmental monitoring program. But because of the very practical differences between monitoring for contaminants within the environment versus monitoring for species distribution and species presence, we'll be tackling those or handling those topics separately throughout the presentation today, with my coworker Annie focusing on the biodiversity monitoring aspects. Here's a slide that provides a bit of an overview of the three monitoring programs: effluent, environmental, and groundwater. Today's talk is about the environmental monitoring program. So the site-wide monitoring program in place is aligned with the CSA N288.4 standard. And we monitor over 100 locations, both on-site and off-site. Some of the media that are sampled include ambient air, surface water, produce, fish, wild game, beach sand, and atmospheric deposition. The overall goal of our site-wide environmental monitoring program is to monitor and evaluate impacts or any impacts of airborne and waterborne effluents or other releases within the receiving natural environment, both on the site and surrounding the site. And the underlying objectives are listed here to assess the level of risk on human and ecological health with respect to those contaminants and physical stressors arising from the site, to verify compliance with any limits on the concentration or intensity of contaminants and physical stressors in the environment. The environmental monitoring program also serves as an independent check on the effectiveness and adequacy of containment and effluent control. So recall that we also have an effluent monitoring program. So in this sense, the environmental monitoring program is sort of a redundant defense in depth approach to verifying the effectiveness and adequacy of containment and controls. And finally, a last objective of our site-wide environmental monitoring program is to verify predictions made by environmental risk assessments. So when is environmental monitoring triggered? Our program contains various criteria or requirements that define when an environmental monitoring program would be required. So first, and these are listed here. So first, if an environmental risk assessment indicates potential concern, then that would warrant the implementation of an environmental monitoring program. If there is a need for having the capability of identifying unusual or unforeseen conditions. If monitoring is needed to support a risk assessment, then the data generated by an environmental monitoring program can be used to that end. And of course, if monitoring is required for any other business reason, for example, if there's a stakeholder concern or just for due diligence reasons. This slide shows the on-site distribution of monitoring locations that are part of our site-wide environmental monitoring program. The largest body of water that you see here, I'm not sure if you could see my mouse as I go over it, is the Ottawa River, which flows in a southeasterly direction. The Chalk River property boundary is denoted by this solid gray line. The sort of grayish polygon near the river's edge is the built-up area, the built-up portion of the Chalk River site. And the orange polygons are the various waste management areas on the site. So as I mentioned before, we monitor over 100 locations, both on-site and off-site. This map shows the on-site locations. All of the, whether they be circular, diamond-shaped, or crosses, all of these icons shown on the map represent the various monitoring locations, be they surface water locations, ambient air, atmospheric deposition, sediment, fish, or garden produce. Game and wild animals are also collected on the site, but these are collected opportunistically when they are found, so they are not depicted on the map that you see in front of you. This is a similar slide, but this time zoomed out a bit more to show the distribution of off-site monitoring locations. So again, the largest body of water that you see here is the Ottawa River. In the center here is the Chalk River site. And you can see that the monitoring locations are distributed in the predominant wind directions, which tend to align with the river, and in the downriver flow direction. And we monitor as far up as 30 kilometers upstream near Ralston, and as far down as 60 kilometers downstream, so covering the town of Petawawa, the city of Pembroke, and Westmeath.
Carla, can we pause for a minute? We do have a question.
Sure.
I don't know, Bernane, are you able to come on and ask us the question in audio or video?
Sure, thanks, Mitch. My question is around slides 9 and 10, you were talking about the purpose of the environmental monitoring. And I want to understand what the linkage is between environmental monitoring and contingency planning or project change. So you're monitoring, you have an unpredicted result. What happens then? How does that affect how you deliver the project or implement contingency measures and so on? Thanks, Mitch.
That's a good question. Thank you. Actually, we have, when we get to the NSDF specific portion of this presentation, we have several slides dedicated to exactly what you're talking about. We call it adaptive management. So we have various criteria or trigger points that the results of our monitoring may reach. And if those are reached, we have certain actions that we take. Whether that be modifying a monitoring program, whether that be considering mitigation strategy changes. But I do have several slides more in the second half of this presentation dedicated to that, if you wouldn't mind waiting until we get there. But I mean, hopefully I've sort of alluded a little bit to what we call our adaptive management strategy. Is that all right?
Sure, that's fine. Unfortunately, I have to leave because I have a prior commitment, but I'll catch up with it. I understand you're going to be posting the recordings, so I'll catch up with it at the recording. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Am I good to carry on, Mitch? Okay, I will continue. This slide just provides a general overview of the monitoring program. Just a few interesting points. The monitoring program is actually quite well established with more than 60 years worth of data and analysis. We collect over 2,000 samples annually and at over 60 locations on site and over 60 locations off site. The sampling frequencies range quite a bit from continuous, for example, all ambient air is monitored continuously, to weekly, which applies to some of our surface waters, to annually, for example, garden produce during the growing season. The choice of parameters to analyze for is heavily based on the source terms of the facilities on the Chalk River site. But in general, analyses are performed for radionuclides, major ions, metals, and a range of organic and inorganic compounds. The data that's generated by the program is evaluated in a systematic manner. We'll compare the results to screening criteria, which allows us to see if there's any significant changes in the data. And we'll also compare to concentrations that afford protection of aquatic or terrestrial biota and human health as well. All of our data is encompassed in a comprehensive quality assurance and quality control program to ensure the quality of the data. And on an annual basis, we have a critical look at our program as a whole to further continual improvement, to ask ourselves if there's any changes required to the program, perhaps based on changes on the operational changes on the site, for example, a new facility. And of course, all of our results are summarized and submitted to the CNSC on an annual basis. The pictures on the right, the middle picture is an example of a garden plot that we collect samples from, and the bottom picture is an example of some of our ambient air monitoring stations. This slide is really just a snapshot. I cannot do justice to all of the data generated by our monitoring program on one slide. But what I've included here is a map of the part of the Perch Lake Basin. So the water body that you see here is the Perch Lake. The orange polygons are waste management areas. The ones sort of immediately sort of north of Perch Lake are the liquid dispersal areas. And there's two streams, this East Swamp Stream and South Swamp Stream that flow into Perch Lake. Via the Perch Lake Inlet. And then water can flow out of Perch Lake via the Perch Lake Outlet and a stream, Perch Creek, out to the Ottawa River. Our long-term monitoring data has shown us that on-site surface water quality is affected in some areas. And these impacts are mostly associated with early waste management practices, such as waste facilities with no engineered barriers or the liquid dispersal pits that I just mentioned. Only a few contaminants actually migrate beyond the source area, primarily tritium and strontium-90. And the long-term trending does show stable or improving conditions in the majority of cases. So the graph on the very bottom left here, I'll guide you through it because it's quite small, shows tritium concentrations in becquerels per liter at East Swamp Stream and South Swamp Stream. The graph immediately to the right of that shows tritium concentrations in becquerels per liter a little bit further downstream at the Perch Lake Inlet 2, the entry point to Perch Lake, and Perch Lake Outlet and Perch Creek Weir further downstream. In terms of off-site monitoring, concentrations of contaminants in off-site environmental media have consistently been very low, which essentially drives a focus on human health rather than ecological health. And with respect to human health, doses are negligible at less than 1% of the public dose limit of 1 millisievert per year. For interest's sake, I've included a graph of the tritium concentrations in the Ottawa River. So again, in becquerels per liter. The bars show both the upstream of Chalk River locations and downstream. So the blue and gray bars are the upstream locations, whereas the red and green bars are the downstream locations. So what this graph shows is that the concentrations of tritium in the Ottawa River have remained very much below the drinking water guideline. This dotted line here at the very top of the graph represents 0.5% of the drinking water guideline. And the levels have also likewise remained much lower than the ecological effects benchmark value. The monitoring that we perform as part of our site-wide environmental monitoring program is subject to some independent monitoring. In the years 2000, 2005, and 2011, ACL contracted Laval University to complete independent monitoring around the Chalk River site. And as of 2012, the CNSC implemented its own independent environmental monitoring program where they'll collect samples in the vicinity of the Chalk River site, and they publish their results on their website if you're interested. So this concludes the description of the contaminants portion of the existing Chalk River site-wide environmental monitoring program. In the next few slides, my coworker Annie will provide a description of the biodiversity aspect of the environmental monitoring program. But before we go there, I'll pause here to answer any questions you may have on what's being discussed so far. And pardon me, I just need to turn the light back on. There we go. Are there any questions on what we've discussed thus far? Mitch, I'll let me know when to continue.
Yeah, we'll take a pause here and see if anyone has any questions. If you do, just raise your hand and be happy to let you ask your question. Okay, well, it appears there's no questions at this time, so I guess we can carry on. Is it on to Annie now, Carla?
Yes, it's on to Annie.
Okay, thanks, Carla, and welcome, Annie.
Thank you, Mitch. Merci, Carla. So on the next few slides, just like Carla, will provide a description of the biodiversity component of the environmental monitoring program. The goal of the biodiversity program is to collect baseline and long-term data on the presence and distribution of species at Chalk River to ensure the protection of individuals and their habitat. The underlying objectives are to prevent harm to species and destruction of their habitat, detect changes in distribution and abundance of species and their habitat on our site, Also to provide data for assessment of ecological health, and to provide support for the development of mitigation measures during the planning phase of projects. With hundreds of species on the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest, it would not be possible to survey for every single species. Thank you, Carla, for changing the slide. For this reason, the biodiversity monitoring is triggered if a species is legally protected by federal laws, if a species and or its habitat is likely to be impacted by CNL operations, if mitigation measures are in place to protect the species and its habitat, and if monitoring is required for other business reasons. For example, it could be for stakeholder concerns or due diligence. We do collect information on species in different ways, including capturing individuals, as shown here with the picture at the top right, where we do have a turtle live trap. We also use passive recorders or automated recorder units to collect audio calls from amphibians or songbirds, for example, as shown with the bottom right picture. And we also use camera traps to capture visual information on species, shown on the picture at the bottom here. Next slide, Carla. Here's a map of the Chalk River site where we monitor on a routine basis for over 100 different species in over 200 different locations, and this on a 5-year cycle. Some examples include, as listed here, monitoring for turtle species, bat species, amphibians, nightjars, which include the common nighthawk, eastern whippoorwill, and barn swallow. We also have monitoring points for invasive species, such as the emerald ash borer, where CNL is part of an early detection network with the Renfrew County and the Petawawa Research Forest. So on this map here, the legend provide additional information on the exact number of survey locations per taxa or species. On the next slide is the overview of the biodiversity monitoring program. So similar to the broader environmental monitoring program that Carla just covered, the biodiversity program is well established with a modest 12 years of data and trend, which is significant for biota. We have over 10,000 observation points on the site and in over 200 locations. The sampling frequency for each taxa is guided by the life cycle of the species and the likelihood of population changes. So for some species, we survey annually, and for other species, we may survey every 5 years. The biota surveys are conducted to gather species distribution information on the site and population trend. We also use the information to inform projects in the development phase. Annual review of program operation enables improvements to be identified and implemented. So the pictures on this slide provide examples of some of the survey. Can you go back, Carla? Thank you. And the picture on the top right, I just want to go over the blending turtle. This is a blending turtle that was captured on the site as part of a telemetry project in collaboration with the University of Ottawa in 2015. The bottom right picture is an example of a little brown myotis, which is a bat species, an endangered species that we captured as part of a telemetry study in collaboration with Trent University. Both projects were done under permit issued by Environment and Climate Change Canada. And the bottom picture is an artificial nesting tower for barn swallow. Thank you, Carla. Next slide, please. So on this slide, I present an overview of the full cycle of the biodiversity program. So it all starts with species observation. So the biodiversity program relies heavily on species that are present on site. As mentioned before, surveys are conducted since 2009 for different biota to understand the presence at Chalk River, their distribution, and abundance. Surveys are now established on a routine basis and on a 5-year cycle. But in addition to the targeted survey that we do conduct, we also heavily rely on our employees who are working out in the field to report observations. Our employees are our eyes and ears in the field, and we ensure that we provide them the tools to recognize species at risk and a protocol to report them to us. For example, at the bottom left is a picture of a booklet that we provide to our employees to help them identify and report species at risk at Chalk River. Once we have the species observation based on the suitable habitat definition for each species, normally provided by Environment and Climate Change Canada in their recovery strategy document, or provided by the Ministry of Northern Development, Mines, Natural Resources and Forestry, we are in a position to identify habitat on our site. So the example presented here in the middle is for Blanding's turtle, where we have a picture that is walking us through the critical habitat identification for the species that is based on physical attributes, so habitat description, and Blanding's turtle observation, for example. Then we can map habitat on our site. And with the species observation and the suitable or habitat or critical habitat identification on the site, we are in a position to develop relevant mitigation measures to ensure the protection of species at risk and their habitat. As seen here on the picture, on the right is a permanent fencing installed along our plant road. Next slide, Carla, please. So while developing the mitigation measures, we always want to retain habitat that are important. In order to do so, we propose mitigation measures such as buffer zones, timing restrictions, physical barriers around the activity in progress. Only if habitat retention is not possible, then we will consider habitat replacement. This might be considered for building demolition, for example, known to be used by barn swallows, where we can provide alternative nesting habitat. If this is not possible, then recovery mitigation measures could include site remediation and rehabilitation for specific species, or individual replacements such as butternut tree planting, for example. Conducting research on a species at risk where the information collected add to the knowledge base of the species and aid in the recovery by increasing our understanding of its behavior would also be considered a recovery initiative. So this concludes the overview of the biodiversity component of the environmental monitoring program. So I will pause here, take questions before I turn it over to Carla to cover the specifics for NSDF.
Thanks, Annie. Yeah, I'll open it up to any questions for a few moments here. Just give people some time if they'd like to come on audio and ask a question. Just put up your hand. If in trouble, you can type your question into the chat as well. Oh, we have Sandra asking a question. Do you do tissue sampling of mammals and birds?
That is a good question. So we will cover this in the adaptive management slide specific for NSDF. But as part of the environmental risk assessment program, we do have some tissue sampling, for example, that is also scheduled.
Thanks. Thanks, Sandra, for asking, getting the conversation started. Perhaps that gave someone some time to see if there's any other questions. Again, just raise your hand and be happy to call on you, or if you're not able to, let me know and through the chat function. Okay, I'm not seeing anything coming in, Annie, so if you'd like to pass it over to Carla again.
Yeah, thank you, Mitch. Your turn, Carla.
All right, thanks, Annie. Thanks, Mitch. So we'll move on to the next slide. So we're at the second part of our presentation today, or I guess I should say third part, really. So what does the NSDF specific environmental monitoring program entail? So recall that the EMP, or the Environmental Monitoring Program, is only one of the 4 components of the NSDF EAFMP, and it focuses on monitoring the receiving environment. So how is this different from the Chalk River Sitewide EMP that we've just finished describing, Annie and I? The short answer is it isn't much different. The EMP for NSDF focuses on verifying the results of the Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS. So the idea being we monitor the receiving environment deemed to be potentially affected by NSDF project activities. The Chalk River Site-wide EMP focuses on monitoring the receiving environment deemed to be potentially affected by all Chalk River site-wide operations. So this would include the NSDF activities. So before we explain the NSDF specific monitoring activities, it might be worthwhile spending just a few minutes describing the NSDF physical components and the NSDF project phases, because we'll be referring to some of these physical components as we speak to the monitoring activities. And some of the project phased activities will dictate what needs to be monitored when. So the Near Surface Disposal Facility, or NSDF, is designed for the disposal of solid low-level radioactive waste. The facility will have an engineered, I'm going to use my mouse here a little bit. The facility will have an engineered containment mound in the center where the waste will be placed. This engineered containment mound will be built in 2 phases. Phase 1 is shown in the upper portion of the figure and will provide capacity for the first 25 years. And phase 2 will then be constructed thereafter. The engineered containment mound will consist of multiple cells, which will be filled one at a time. And when a cell is full, a temporary cover followed by a final cover will be installed to prevent precipitation from entering the waste and to minimize leachate generation. There will be a leachate collection system, which will direct any leachate to a waste water treatment plant here in white, with the treated effluent then directed to an exfiltration gallery to recharge the groundwater, or directly into Perch Lake under high water table conditions. The NSDF project will take place in 4 phases: construction, operation, closure, and post-closure. During the construction phase, this is when the engineered containment mound liner system and the perimeter berm will be built. The surface water management infrastructure, I forgot to mention that on the last slide. There will be a surface water management system which will direct clean water, water that has not come into contact with the waste, to 3 stormwater ponds. So this system will be built during the construction phase. And the wastewater treatment plant will also be constructed during the construction phase. The operation phase will involve a phased development of the disposal cells and placement of the low-level waste into these cells, with progressive closure of the cells and installation of a temporary and final cover. The wastewater treatment plant, which collects leachate, will operate throughout the entire duration of the operation phase and discharge the treated effluent to the exfiltration gallery or directly to Perch Lake. The closure phase will involve installation of any remaining components of the final cover of the engineered containment mound, decommissioning of any infrastructure that is no longer necessary, remediation and grading of the NSDF site, and note that the wastewater treatment plant will continue to operate during the closure phase until final closure of the cover of the engineered containment mound, until there is no leachate anymore. Post-closure will involve surveillance and inspection activities to verify the integrity of the facility as long as necessary. The monitoring objectives of the NSDF Environmental Monitoring Program are organized by environmental discipline, or what we call valued components. And these are listed in the leftmost column of this table. So when it comes to the atmospheric environment, one of the main monitoring objectives of the NSDF EMP is to verify the environmental impact statement prediction that ambient air quality is within air quality criteria. Sorry about that. In the surface water environment, one of the objectives is to confirm that the function and structure of the wetland systems is maintained, and to verify the EIS predictions related to surface quality, that there should be no significant adverse effect on surface water quality. The terrestrial environment focuses more so on biodiversity monitoring in terms of habitat availability, habitat distribution, survival, and reproduction. And the objectives of the monitoring program, again, are to verify EIS predictions, but this time related to relative species abundance, to confirm the effectiveness of mitigation measures put in place to protect species at risk. And for Blandings turtle specifically, additional objectives include to identify and map critical habitat, to perform artificial nest mound surveys, and to confirm the use of culverts. And our last environmental discipline listed here, ambient radioactivity and ecological health and human health. The main objective here is to verify the effectiveness of mitigation measures. Just a reminder and a note that the EIS predicts no significant adverse environmental effects due to NSDF activities in any of these environmental disciplines. This slide shows the various individual monitoring activities that will take place for NSDF, and it shows them on a timeline. So it shows the time span over which these monitoring activities will take place. So starting with construction, that will kickstart several monitoring activities. It will kickstart monitoring air quality, for non-radiological aspects. As you can imagine, construction will entail dust, so monitoring for suspended particulate matter becomes an important thing to do. Construction is a physical disturbance, so that will kickstart the monitoring of wetland water elevations and wetland surface water flows to ensure no significant change in those aspects. And of course, with the physical disturbance of construction, also kickstarted is biodiversity monitoring. So monitoring habitat availability, habitat distribution, and survival and reproduction for various terrestrial species. So going back up a bit here, monitoring for air quality on a non-RAD side and wetland integrity will take place over the construction phase as well as the operation phase. Monitoring for biodiversity will kickstart at construction, excuse me, and continue on into and including closure phase. At the operational phase, when low-level waste is starting to be placed in the engineered containment mound cells, that's when monitoring for radioactivity and dust emissions comes into play. And this will be for the duration of the operational phase only. Also kickstarted at the start of operation is the monitoring of surface water quality surrounding the engineered containment mound footprint and the monitoring of ambient radioactivity. And these latter two activities will continue on into post-closure. The next few slides, including this one here in front of you, will provide a lot more detail on each of these monitoring activities. So we'll start with air quality. This is a bit of a busy slide, so I'll try to work through it slowly. The objectives of monitoring air quality are multifold. First of all, we need to confirm the EIS prediction that air quality remains below air quality criteria. Second, monitoring for air quality can also help us in assessing risk to non-human biota and to humans by comparing to the appropriate benchmark values. So what we propose to do, if you look at the map on the right, we propose to monitor 4 different locations, 2 locations at the NSDF site boundary and 2 at the boundary of the engineered containment mound. There will be high volume air samplers placed here, and monitoring will take place for suspended particulate matter, lead and mercury in dust, radioactivity screening of dust, and ambient radioactivity monitoring for tritium, carbon-14, radon, and gamma radiation. There's several monitoring activities that, although strictly speaking, are not part of the environmental monitoring program. I have listed them here. They are part of the OCM, or Operational Control Monitoring. So on the work sites, both upwind and downwind of activities, there will be daily visual inspections for dust, for example, with spot measurements taken. Overlaid on the capped engineered containment mound, there will be a 30-meter grid sampling for methane gas, which is a typical type of monitoring that is done for landfills. And there will be subsurface probes around the perimeter of the engineered containment mound for bulk landfill gas monitoring. That includes methane, carbon dioxide, oxygen, and hydrogen sulfide. The monitoring frequency for these many parameters that I've just mentioned are listed in the table here. Suspended particulate matter will be monitored weekly, so every 6 days for a continuous 24-hour sampling period. And this is consistent with industry standard. Lead and mercury will be empirically measured 3 times during each phase to establish a relationship to the suspended particulate matter, so that we can establish an SPM trigger level that will alert us to lead and mercury levels over a certain threshold. Radioactivity screening in dust will coincide with the frequency for suspended particulate matter, so that is weekly over a 24-hour period. And ambient radioactivity for carbon-14, tritium, radon, gamma radiation will be continuous sampling. The analyses will be quarterly for tritium, carbon-14, and radon, and semi-annual for gamma radiation. The monitoring activities that are part of the operational control monitoring are listed here as well. The visual inspection for dust will be done on a daily basis. The methane landfill gas via the 30-meter grid will be done on a weekly basis. And the bulk landfill gases via the subsurface probes will be done monthly during operations and periodically during closure. The picture on the top right is a picture of a high volume air sampler. The picture at the bottom in the middle is an example of the tritium and carbon-14 sampling station. Monitoring for wetland water elevations and surface water flows. The objective of monitoring wetland water elevations and surface water flows is to confirm the EIS prediction that there should be no change to the integrity of the wetland. The water levels and surface water flows should remain similar to pre-construction period. So that's one of the main objectives of this monitoring. And the locations that we propose to monitor are locations that are downstream of any potentially impacted, are downstream of the engineered containment mound, of the NSDF site, of the potential discharge of the wastewater treatment plant to the exfiltration gallery and the perch lake. So we propose to monitor, I'm pointing to the map here, East Swamp Stream, so the orange dots on the map, and Perch Creek Weir. So these would be representative of potentially impacted or downstream locations. We also propose to monitor mainstream as a background location. So a location that should not be impacted by construction or operation of the NSDF. And it will serve to be able to benchmark any changes we see at East Swamp Stream and Perch Creek Weir in terms of natural variations in water flow measurements and level measurements. The frequency at which we propose to monitor these is weekly, and this is consistent with our current monitoring program, actually. All three of these locations are already a part of our routine monitoring program. A weekly frequency should be sufficient to be able to qualify the water flow and water level. It should be sufficient to encompass various different conditions, whether they be storm events or calm days. At the bottom here are two pictures. The one on the left is a picture of the weir currently in place at East Swamp Stream. And the picture on the right is a picture of the weir currently in place at Perch Creek Stream. The manner in which flow measurements and water level measurements will be taken can vary. We may decide to use the weir systems already in place. We may decide to use dye dilution gauging. There's various methods by which we could measure flow and water level. Surface water quality is another monitoring aspect of the NSDF environmental monitoring program. The inflow surface waters potentially impacted would include the locations shown in orange here. The main objective of this monitoring is to confirm the EIS prediction that there should be no significant adverse effect on the surface quality downstream of the NSDF activities. So for this purpose, we've chosen East Swamp Stream, which flows into Perch Lake Inlet 2, into Perch Lake. PLO, which is Perch Lake Outlet. The water flows out of Perch Lake into Perch Creek, and we'll monitor Perch Creek as well. In terms of what parameters we will be looking at these four locations, they will be quite varied. The choice of parameters is based on contaminants of potential concern present in the waste, and that may be associated with the leachate or contact surface water. So these will include physical chemical characteristics like pH, temperature, dissolved oxygen, and specific conductivity, with the latter two, dissolved oxygen and specific conductivity, being good indicators for habitat, aquatic habitat, the health of the aquatic habitats as well. Non-radiological parameters will include phosphorus, total suspended solids, a suite of metals, volatiles, and ions like nitrites, nitrates. And in terms of radiological parameters, we are proposing to monitor gross alpha activity and gross beta activity. So these will be gross indicators of radioactivity concentrations. And should we see elevated levels, we can perform radionuclide specific analyses. We will also be routinely performing gamma spectrometry on these surface water samples, which will provide us with the concentrations of a large suite of beta gamma emitters, including cobalt-60, which is predicted to be present in the wastewater treatment plant effluent, and of course, tritium. The frequency at which we will monitor these locations is proposed to be weekly at East Swamp Weir, Perch Lake Inlet 2, and Perch Creek, and monthly at Perch Lake Outlet. These frequencies are consistent with our current monitoring program frequencies. The next few slides are on the specific monitoring activities for biodiversity. So Annie, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Carla. So similar to the slides presented by Carla, I will go over a series of 5 or 6 slides, including maps showing the details of the proposed biodiversity monitoring program in the draft environmental assessment follow-up monitoring. So on this slide here, we see a map of the Chalk River site where we see the proposed footprint of the NSDF project represented by the solid orange polygon. And there is an area around the polygon represented by a dashed orange line that represents the local study area, which is a 250-meter buffer around the project footprint. This area is important for the follow-up monitoring program for biodiversity, as it is the area that was considered for the assessment of the potential impact from NSDF on terrestrial biota. So forest songbird is a taxa identified in the environmental impact statement as being potentially impacted by the construction and operation of NSDF, removal of forested land, and an increase in noise or the potential disturbances. To ensure the persistence of songbirds at risk, the follow-up monitoring is proposing to monitor in 4 locations within the local study area, within the orange line, to ensure the local persistence of the species. But we are also proposing an additional 30 points, monitoring points scattered throughout the Chalk River site. Those are the purple points that we see on the map. The targeted species are species at risk, such as the Canada warbler, eastern wood pewee, golden wing warbler, and the wood thrush. But our method of detection is using automated recorder units or passive recorders, which will be collecting audio calls. So any other species of bird detected during the analysis of the calls will also be noted. With the audio calls, we will be able to collect richness information and activity levels, and we can also detect some breeding evidence. So this survey is on a 5-year cycle based on the ecology of the species. And during the survey, we will deploy recorders twice during the breeding period to ensure that we capture the entire suite of bird species, as some species are known to be late breeder, for example, the Canada warbler. So if we do the survey too early during the breeding season, we may not detect Canada warbler only because it is not in Canada yet. So this monitoring is part of the routine monitoring program and was last conducted in 2019. Next slide, please. On the next slide, we have the eastern whippoorwill. It is another species identified as being potentially impacted by the NSDF project, similar to forest songbirds. For this species, the same local study area was assessed as part of NSDF environmental impact statement, and 4 monitoring locations are located within the local study area, and 38 additional locations are distributed throughout the Chalk River site, as shown on the map here with the dots. With this survey, we can detect both nightjar species, which are the eastern whippoorwill and the common nighthawk, as shown on the picture here on the slide. The monitoring locations are established following the Canadian NIGAR survey protocol. And in replacement of in-person survey, we will be using automated recorder units, and we will collect information on the species presence and activity level. The recorders will be programmed to record during the period of time when the full moon is up high in the sky during the months of May and June, as per the protocol. And this survey is part of the routine biodiversity monitoring program and was last conducted in 2020. Next species, or on the next slide, our bat species. So bats are also present at Chalk River, and they were identified as being potentially impacted by the removal of forest as part of NSDF. Similar to other species, the follow-up monitoring will focus on two distinct areas, the local study area and the rest of the site. So within the local study area, we have installed 16 bat boxes in 8 different locations. So the bat boxes are represented by the blue dots on the map surrounding the NSDF footprint. The picture included here on this slide is showing the disposition of the bat boxes. They are installed 2 back-to-back to offer a wide range of temperature within the bat boxes. The bat boxes were installed in May 2018 and are being monitored for occupancy annually. So in addition of the bat boxes, we will also be collecting bat activity levels using automated recorder units or passive recorders as shown on the legend of the map. So we have 4 locations within the local study area and 41 additional locations throughout the Chalk River site. The targeted species for this specific survey are the little brown myotis, northern myotis, the tricolored bat, and the eastern small-footed myotis, so the bat at risk. But we also collect information on all other bat species. So the automated recorder units are collecting ultrasonic calls from bats passing by the microphone. So bat species have a distinct call pattern, and we can identify the species using a software such as Sonobat or Kaleidoscope. So the activity level of the bat activity level is expressed in passes per hour or calls per hour for each species. So for the bat boxes, we do monitor them by conducting a visual count for each bat box boxes that are occupied. The telemetry project in collaboration with Trent University confirmed that so far that only little brown myotis are using the bat boxes. So we are proposing an annual count of the bat boxes and the deployment of the passive recorder on a 5-year cycle. The bat monitoring is part of the routine biodiversity monitoring program. And the passive recorders were deployed last time across the site in 2019, and the bat boxes are monitored annually. For Blandings turtle on the next slide, so the Chalk River site is home to a small population of Blandings turtle. Due to the large overland movement and home range, individuals occupy a large portion of the Chalk River site. So this species was identified as potentially impacted by an NSDF project if no mitigation measures were implemented. The potential impact from the project are removal of habitat and rural mortality. For this reason, several mitigation measures have been put in place, and the follow-up monitoring is proposing measures to ensure the persistence of the small population at Chalk River. So for this species, several types of monitoring are proposed, and specifically for Blandings turtle, but we also have to understand that the monitoring will also include other turtle species. So on the map here, we see that several eco passages have been created in 2020 at the Chalk River site and are available to turtles as of this year, as of the spring 2021. So the current eco passages that are composed of a large square concrete culvert in a system of permanent fencing are identified with the blue crosses on the map. If the NSDF is approved, we propose to add an additional 4 eco passages on the site, and we are proposing 3 on Plant Road identified with the pink crosses, and 1 at Perch Lake Outlet, just south of the NSDF footprint. The eco passages locations were selected in areas of high activity by the species and a high risk of roe mortality. So in addition of the eco passages for turtle, we also have a total of 6 artificial nest mounds that were created in 2020 and also available to turtles in 2021. The artificial nest mounds are identified by the red squares on the map. So both locations, well, all those locations, so artificial nest mounds and eco passages, are proposed monitoring locations in the EA follow-up monitoring plan. And also because the Blanding's turtle is an endangered species under the Species at Risk Act, we do have critical habitat at Chalk River, and the availability of the species critical habitat will be also monitored. So as mentioned, although the EA follow-up monitoring plan focuses on Blanding's turtle, other wildlife species will also benefit from the mitigation measures, and we will be capturing information on other species with our monitoring methods. So for example, to date, we have recorded several species using the eco passages, including several turtle species, so snapping turtle, Blanding's turtle, but also Midland Pendant turtle. But we have detected mammals such as rodents, a bear, bats, and also amphibians and snakes. So the use of artificial nest mounds and the protection of nests is also another parameter that we will be monitoring as part of this EAFMP, along with the availability of the critical habitat for the Blanding's turtle. So the frequency of monitoring will vary depending on what we are monitoring. So for example, the eco passages will be monitored continuously using trail cameras that will be programmed to take a picture every minute during the active season of the Blanding's turtle. But the nest mounds, we are proposing to monitor nest mounds visually weekly, but we also have a means to monitor continuously using trail cameras. And finally, an assessment of the availability of the critical habitat for the Blanding's turtle will be conducted and refined every year at the Chalk River site. So, and Carla mentioned earlier the operational control monitoring. So as part of the operational control monitoring for Blanding's turtle, the eco passages and artificial nest mounds integrity will be verified every year to ensure that they are still functioning as they should. And the last species, and my last slide, is the eastern milk snake. So the eastern milk snake was identified in the environmental impact statement due to the potential for roe mortality. But roe mortality is also identified for the Blanding's turtle. So the follow-up monitoring for those species will also capture, so the follow-up monitoring will capture roe mortality for eastern milk snake and Blanding's turtle, but also other amphibians and reptile species. So we are proposing to conduct roe mortality survey to detect mortality on Plant Road, but also all the roads that are surrounding the NSDF footprint. So fencing will be installed, temporary fencing will be installed around the NSDF footprint during the construction period, and a permanent fencing during the operation period. So the fencing is to prevent wildlife entry into the NSDF footprint. But the proposed fencing is also in addition to the fencing that is part of the eco passages that I just discussed on the previous slide. So as part of the follow-up monitoring, we are proposing to monitor for fencing integrity and roe mortality. So role mortality surveys will be conducted weekly during the active period of the species. So for milk snake and blending turtle. And as part of the operational control monitoring, the integrity of the temporary fencing will be inspected weekly and after heavy rain events. And the permanent fencing will be inspected at least annually for integrity and washout repair. So the role mortality survey is part of the annual biodiversity routine monitoring program. So on this, I will turn it over to Carla to conclude on the presentation.
Thanks, Annie. So now that we've gathered all of this data, done all this monitoring, what are we going to do with the data? This slide tries to demonstrate that we have set up a two-tiered data evaluation system. The first tier will compare the data to the environmental impact statement predictions, trend analysis, maybe a fraction of the tier 2 criteria. And the tier 2 criteria include comparing the data to baseline conditions, environmental benchmarks, federal provincial air quality guidelines, guidelines for the protection of aquatic life. And in terms of biodiversity monitoring, tier 2 criteria to look at are, has there been any abandonment of habitat? Has there been any herpetofauna road mortality? Are we observing a decline of a local population? So what happens if these tier 1 and tier 2 criteria are triggered? The response is commensurate with the level of risk. But in any case, if a tier 1 criteria is met, the first thing to do is to review that data, perform some trend evaluation, resample potentially to confirm an exceedance with respect to a contaminant in the environment, and then investigate, if we were able to confirm that the data is correct, to then investigate the source of that trigger or of that exceedance. In the case of biodiversity, to investigate the observed decline of species observations, and to consider increasing monitoring frequency, or in the case of biodiversity, consider providing additional habitat. If tier 2 criteria are exceeded, much of the initial steps are the same: to review the data and confirm that the criteria was met, investigate the source of the exceedance in terms of a contaminant, or for biodiversity monitoring, investigate the observed decline of population. And this is when, with a tier 2 criteria trigger, we would start to consider applying additional mitigation measures and consider remediation. We may decide to stop work. And of course, we can also decide to enhance our monitoring, increase the frequency, add additional parameters, additional locations. The other thing that's triggered via a tier 2 criteria is what we call triggered monitoring. And I'll talk about that in the next 2 slides. So there are certain media that were assessed as part of the EIS, but where the EIS predicted no effects to those media. And so they are not part of the initial environmental monitoring program unless they're triggered. So the next 2 slides, these 2 slides show what these media are and what triggers the start of monitoring that particular media. So in the surface water environment, if surface water or groundwater samples exceed tier 2 criteria for contaminants, sediments may be impacted, and that's what warrants the kickstart of sediment quality monitoring. And the monitoring for sediment would take place at locations downstream of where the exceedances were identified. In the geological environment, soil quality and wet and dry deposition may be triggered. If groundwater monitoring exceeds tier 2 criteria for contaminants, or if there's a spill or an unforeseen condition, soil monitoring may be required. And depending on the circumstance, if it's groundwater that triggered a tier 2 criteria, then monitoring for soil would take place up gradient of that observed groundwater impact. If the condition is a spill or an unforeseen condition, then monitoring for soil would take place in the area of that event. If atmospheric media under the environmental monitoring program exceed tier 2 criteria for contaminants, soil monitoring may be triggered as well. And again, that monitoring would take place in the area where atmospheric emissions exceeded the tier 2 criteria. In the aquatic environment, fish and benthic macroinvertebrate communities are not part of the NSDF EMP. However, monitoring for those can be triggered under the NSDF EMP if surface water monitoring in Perch Lake and Perch Creek exceed tier 2 criteria. Then we would start to monitor the fish tissue in Perch Lake and Perch Creek. Similarly, if sediment sampling is triggered, as we saw on the slide in the previous slide, on surface water or groundwater exceedances of tier 2 criteria, then we would also kickstart monitoring the benthic macroinvertebrate community at the locations where those exceedances occurred. Under the terrestrial environment, if the species at risk monitoring indicates significant effects, additional monitoring would be designed based on the effects identified. And if atmospheric media or groundwater exceed tier 2 criteria for contaminants, then we may also start vegetation monitoring in the area where those exceedances took place. So I hope this provides a bit of an idea of how adaptive the environmental monitoring program for NSDF is proposed to be. Results for the environmental monitoring program for NSDF will be reported to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission annually. And the results will be included in 2 reports, in fact. They will be included in our current integrated environmental monitoring report because we perceive the NSDF as another facility within the Chalk River site, and that warrants reporting in our overall site-wide monitoring report. The results will also be included in a specific NSDF environmental assessment follow-up monitoring report. It's important to note, though, that as the EAFMP objectives are being met, as we show that the monitoring meets or the EIS predictions, that monitoring will slowly move into our routine site-wide monitoring program, so that eventually there would be only the integrated environmental monitoring report reporting on those results. We have an adaptive management strategy for the EMP, which I've alluded to already, talking about the triggered monitoring, talking about the tier 1 and tier 2 criteria. So the day-to-day data interpretation and evaluation of the data with comparison to these tier 1 and tier 2 criteria allow for that adaptive management, because we will react to exceedances of the tier 1 and tier 2 criteria in the ways I described earlier. In addition to that day-to-day data interpretation and evaluation, we will have focused annual data assessments. And these will be focused on data interpretation and trends for the past year. And any observations that we make will inform actions. For example, we may decide to implement additional monitoring, or we may decide to start a special investigation. And separate from the annual data assessments, we also plan to hold an annual program review. The program review is meant to assess the continuing adequacy and effectiveness of the monitoring program design. So this time we're focused on the design of the monitoring program in relation to changes in regulations or changes in risk profile or changes in operations. And we will be reviewing the adequacy of our strategies of monitoring, our procedures, the way we manage our data, the data quality, and we will draw a conclusion on the effectiveness of the existing monitoring program in accomplishing its objectives. And again, observations that we make during this annual program review will inform improvement actions. We may have recommendations for additional or modified mitigation measures. We may make changes to monitoring locations or parameters. We may consider increasing frequencies based on an observed adverse change in the environment, or decreasing frequency based on no observed effects for 5 years. I'm hoping giving you a sense that the environmental monitoring program is planned to be dynamic with a goal of continuous improvement and continuous alignment to what's being observed in the field. So this is the last slide of our presentation. So just to summarize, the EMP is the Environmental Monitoring Program is one of 4 components of the EAFMP, and each component is aligned with respective Canadian Standards Association standards. Results will be reported and submitted annually to the CNSC. And I've described a bit the adaptive management that will be employed as the NSDF project evolves and as the data comes in. The EAFMP draft is currently available on the CNL NSDF website, and we really do welcome any feedback you may have on the EAFMP. And again, to reiterate, it will not be finalized until a commission decision is made. So that ends our presentation, and I guess we can open it up for questions again for Annie or myself or anybody else on the team.
Thank you, Carla, and thank you, Annie, for the presentation. Yes, let's open it up to any questions from the audience. Once again, if you do have a question, just hold up your virtual hand and I will go to you to ask it. If you're not able to, just please type it into the chat. I do have one that's come in the chat. And so I will ask it. Why is the NSDF project not monitoring the Ottawa River for surface water quality?
I can take that one. So surface water quality is an aspect that is very prevalent in our site-wide monitoring program already. As part of our site-wide monitoring program, we do monitor the Ottawa River at various locations, both upstream and at the immediate boundary of the Chalk River site, as well as at various locations downstream of the site. So I guess perhaps that's the answer as to why it wasn't included in the NSDF specific monitoring program. I'll reemphasize, I guess, that the NSDF specific environmental monitoring program does include monitoring surface water at Perch Creek, which is the location where if there were any impacts, that's where they would be observed. And that's prior to the entry into the Ottawa River. I don't know if there was anybody else on the team who feel that they want to add to that answer.
Any other additional information?
Yeah, Martin Plukas speaking. So just one further comment, that a comprehensive response from Carla, just one more item. So the EIS predicted no effects on surface water quality for the Ottawa River, and that's the other reason why we're not monitoring as part of the NSDF project.
Thanks, Martin.
Yep, thank you, Martin. Okay, I'll open it up again for any other questions. Again, just hold up your virtual hand, or if you're not able to, just pop your question into the chat there. Okay, I'm not seeing anything, so I'll start to wrap things up. But as I'm wrapping things up, perhaps some questions will come in. So some wrap up. So again, thank you very much everyone for attending and spending some time here with us this morning, learning about the groundwater or the environmental monitoring program. Our next session will be held at the same time on Thursday, October 7th, and that will focus on the groundwater monitoring. Once again, registration is required. And you can do that the same way you did to register for this this webinar. If you do happen to have a question after that comes to you, or if you're viewing the YouTube link after this video is posted, any additional questions can be emailed to ermstakeholder@cnl.ca, and we would be happy to get back to you on anything that comes to you after this webinar is up. Okay, I'll just check in one more time to see. Okay, what will the project do if new species at risk are added to the federal or provincial lists?
Thank you, Mitch. Thinking this one's for me. So we do review the proposed species. So the COSEWIC, the federal committee doing the assessment for species at risk, they do have a 5-year plan for species that are coming up for assessment, whether to be added to the species at risk list or to be reclassified. So we do follow this very closely. So we do have a good idea of the species that are going to be added to the Species at Risk Act. So I talked a lot about species at risk, but I do not make a distinction between whether it's a species officially listed under a Species at Risk Act, or if it's a species listed on the proposed to be added to the act itself. So we do monitor for broad suite of species, and we are aware, and we do some preliminary survey for species that we know are going to be listed. So in this case, if a species was going to be added to the Species at Risk Act and it wasn't considered during the environmental impact statement, we would do the same thing as we do for any other operations of the site. We would review the operations of NSDF and assess the potential impact of the species, and decide if we need to develop mitigation measures and start a monitoring program on the species.
Okay, thank you very much, Annie. I'm not seeing any more hands or questions coming in. So with that, I'll wrap things up. Thank you everyone for your time once again, and I hope to see you at the next webinar on October 7th. Take care.